Hey, this is Lisa Graves with Legal AF on the Midas Touch Network. I'm so excited to be part of Court Accountability Action and have the chance to bring new voices to you, or people who you should know about, who you may not have heard about. The amazing Hardy Merriman is here to join me here on Legal AF today. And if you like this kind of content where you're learning new things from amazing thinkers, I hope you'll subscribe and like. Hardy Merriman is someone who I first learned about early this year. I should have learned about him sooner because his work has been so very important. He's someone who for more than 20 years has been working in the field of civil resistance, supporting movements to advance human rights and freedom and justice around the world. He previously served as the president of the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and he was also the CEO of that organization previously. He's been an advisor to USAID in its Powered by the People program in the previous administration. He has a new publication called Harnessing Our Power to End Political Violence, and he is an author of books and other writings. But really, the reason why I wanted to bring Hardy on is because when I first met him, I was astonished, honestly astonished by the findings, by some of the findings he shared about authoritarianism, about the risks of facing America from authoritarianism, growing authoritarianism. And also, I was so encouraged by the hope he brought to that very hard conversation about how countries facing authoritarianism have turned things around, have been able to really restore and expand their democracies in the aftermath of a period of rising authoritarianism. So without further ado, please join me in essence in welcoming Hardy Merriman to Legal AF.
Great. Thank you so much, Lisa. It's great to be here.
Oh my goodness. I am so glad that you agreed to come on to talk with us. And I hope we're going to have one of many conversations about this. But I'm going to ask you, maybe not a hard question, but a question that's maybe hard to hear the answer to, which is where, based on your expertise, your assessment, based on other expertise that you've read, where is America right now in 2025 in terms of authoritarianism?
Sure. I think one way to answer it would be to say, if we lay out a line, right, and we put democracy as an ideal on one end and authoritarianism as an ideal on the other end. The United States, where it is right now, in my view, has crossed the 50% line. It has crossed closer to the authoritarian side. That doesn't make it the worst authoritarian country in the world. We still have democratic institutions. We should use them. But it does mean that the way that politics is happening in this country, the way that the legal system is starting to function, the way that institutions are being attacked, the way that rights are not being protected, all are starting to resemble more of an authoritarian regime than a democratic government. And the rate at which this has happened has been shocking to me. I've watched democracies backslide around the world. I've seen autocrats learn from each other. We hear that there is an autocratic playbook to do this, and there certainly is. And it is clear to me that the current administration has learned from that playbook and is trying to do it as fast as possible. Yeah. And the thing about it also is that actually this is consistent with what we know about democratic backsliding. So there's a great study that came out a few years ago, and it looks at 120 years of data from 1900 to 2019. And it asks a couple questions. So the first question it asks is, how often do democracies backslide? And by backsliding, I mean a sort of sustained decline in rule of law, the quality of elections, protections of rights, free media, or independent media. How often do they backslide? Pretty rarely. Democracies sort of have a sustained decline in those things only about 2 to 3% of the time. 2 to 3% of the years that democracy is in existence will systematically backslide. But then the research asks another question, and it says, when democracies backslide, how often do they break down into authoritarianism? And the answer is actually shocking, because what they find is that it's about 70% of the time.
Wow.
So this seems to almost contradict each other, right? So on the one hand, if you live in a democracy, your experience is that it's relatively stable. The rules aren't always fair. There can be enclaves of authoritarianism and corruption in democracies. Not everyone experiences the benefit of democracy equally, but the rules of the game, the rules of how you engage, are stable. And yet the same body of data tells us that when that destabilizes, democracies are actually very vulnerable to breaking down into authoritarianism. And as a country, we're not exempt from that, clearly.
And can you describe on that scale of that ideal of democracy, or like a fully thriving democracy and an authoritarian regime, where is America right now, and how fast has this shift happened in your observation, in your estimation?
Sure. So if you want to look on paper at when it happened, you could even point actually to previous Supreme Court rulings as doing an enormous amount of damage. The stripping of executive, the granting of executive immunity
Yeah.
is a major decline in our quality of
Yeah.
democracy that happened before actually the 2024 election. So
Yeah.
some could even argue that on paper you started to see us cross the line from democracy to authoritarianism. But certainly now we look at in practice what's happened. And one of the things about democracies and when they change, it's very tricky to say this is the exact day it changed.
Right.
But what we can say is that over the last 9 months, we have clearly seen a shift where now we are net on the autocratic side rather than the democratic side. Things can't always get worse, and it's for us to make sure that we form what we call a democratic U-turn, where yes, we might break down, but that we can actually come back. And there are plenty of democracies historically that have done that as well.
Yeah. Wow. I was very, very concerned when the U.S. Supreme Court took that case last year in 2024, where they overturned the lower court ruling that had held, consistent with all of American history, that no president is above the law, that no president is entitled to immunity from criminal prosecution. And yet this captured Supreme Court, in my view, issued a counter constitutional ruling, a ruling that took out a key pillar of American democracy by allowing an executive branch official to be above the law. And in my view, also paved the way for Trump's return to power, because then he wasn't held accountable for the crimes he was charged with. And then this court this year, as this president has been acting with so unilaterally, in such defiance of longstanding constitutional provisions, statutory provisions, regulations, legal precedents, and this court has been basically mowing down lower court rulings, temporary restraining orders that were attempting to apply the law as it has existed in America to protect people's interests, people's rights. We've seen this, like the second chapter of this unfold, and it's mind-boggling to see one person in Donald Trump moving forward this authoritarian agenda. But it's not just Donald Trump, it's the people he's surrounded by, and also the court, and also some members of Congress that have really seemingly embraced this, in my view, reckless notion that a president is not bound by the laws in a civil society. Can you share with us your thoughts on that, and any other parallels, the current parallels or recent parallels for this type of scenario that we're seeing unfold?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would agree with you completely on the role of the Supreme Court. They created enabling conditions for a democratic backsliding. When you look at the way they've opened our political system to influence even further for money in politics, now 15 years ago, that is directly pulling accountability away from the people and giving it to, in this case, corporations and extremely wealthy. And so what happens after a period of time when people consistently experience their aspirations thwarted is they start saying, look, regardless of which politician gets elected, my position in life doesn't get better. And eventually they stop blaming one party or another and start blaming the entire system. Now, we can go back and forth about whether that's fair or not. But regardless, as people continue to say, my life is not getting better in any kind of discernible way for decades,
Right.
they start to say, look, I'm become more receptive now to an argument that we need a major change that goes outside of the bounds of what democracy has been. And so the court has enabled conditions by often stifling an agenda that would actually provide to millions of working people in this country, and directly through the reasons you mentioned, with regards to the immunity decision, with regards to other enabling decisions they have made. It has been a factor in how quickly we have been able to backslide. One of the things that's unprecedented here is I can't think of another case where you have had a Supreme Court and an aspiring autocrat in lockstep so early. Normally, you would expect the Supreme Court to slow things down. And slowing things down really matters. Time really matters. It does not get easier to fight an aspiring autocrat over time. it only gets harder. That's why you try to push back early. You would count on the Supreme Court to try to do that pushback, which buys time to continue for civil society to organize to push back. In this case, we've seen the opposite. So this is one factor in why it has changed so quickly. But I want to be clear, we're talking about really challenging stuff, and it is on any given day we can look at the headlines and become depressed and feel that, we are losing. In fact, there are some really good signs too. Like I said, there's a playbook to push back against authoritarians. Not just authoritarians have their playbook, but there is a resistance playbook. And it's really important that we learn from that as well.
Well, let's take up that in part two, the things that people can do to push back. But before we leave the sort of description of what's happened, I know that you have described previously some of those factors that show these signs of that authoritarian playbook. And you've said that includes direct investigations against critics, giving license to lawbreaking, regulatory retaliation against enemies or opponents, deploying the military domestically, federal law enforcement overreach, and when an autocrat won't leave or says that they, suggest they won't leave, as we've been hearing these recent claims about a third term in defiance of the plain language of the Constitution that bars a third term. I wonder, before we talk about how people can push back in part two, if you could share a little bit about your observations of those factors that you've outlined before, and what your assessment is of what we're seeing in that regard.
Sure. I mean, I think we've seen everything you just listed. I would say we can check those boxes. And attempts to shift the rules for the next election, ranging from, yes, rhetorically floating the idea of a third term, but then also gerrymandering and all the other attempts at trying to shift the playing field before the elections are even held. That is classic authoritarian behavior. With regard to domestic deployment of the military, overuse and operating the police outside of the bounds of the law. These are self-evident. We're seeing them in the headlines daily. Autocrats use regulatory retaliation to cow corporations into going along with their agenda as well. We've seen that. But I would make another point. So there are still plenty of folks who might say, look, we might just be, how can I put it? Well, they might be going after people who they don't like, but I'm not going to stand up. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to wait for this to pass. I'll be okay. And I want folks to understand something about authoritarianism. Even if you are not deeply concerned about their attacks on rights, even if you are not deeply concerned about their overuse of the military or whatever it is, authoritarianism is a systemic risk that affects basically everything we care about. There's research to back this up. When you compare democracies versus authoritarian governments, democracies do better on gender equality. They do better on economic growth. Democracies manage their economies on average much better than authoritarian governments. Authoritarian governments are 3 times as likely to experience an economic crisis. Democracies invest more in their social safety nets. They have better public health outcomes, longer life expectancies, lower infant mortality. Democracies have much less corruption. Democracies protect labor rights better. They pay higher wages. They invest more in education. They have a lower risk of civil war. They do not wage war internationally against other democracies. There are so many reasons. On average, democracies have better responses to climate change. That's not to say that these were sufficient in our country. Our response to climate change was not sufficient in many other things. But you cannot argue that any of this will get better if we become more authoritarian. So it is a systemic risk to become authoritarian. And I think that the opportunity in this is to understand that struggle against authoritarianism is a women's rights struggle. It is a racial justice struggle. It is an economic justice struggle. It is a climate struggle. It is a peace and security struggle. We are all in this boat together, and we can actually form coalitions in common cause because all of our issues are going to be affected.
That is so compelling and so right. And that's why I'm going to invite our watchers, our audience, to come back for part 2 with you, with Hardy Merriman, where we're going to talk about some of those important examples we can see of how people in other countries have made that democratic U-turn, to restore civil society, to expand our rights. Thank you for joining me here on part one, Hardy. Thank you for agreeing to come back for part two right away. And we will see you all in a moment. Again, this is Lisa Graves with Court Accountability Action for Legal AF, here with Hardy Merriman in part one of a two-part series, the beginning of a number of conversations we'll be having with Hardy. Please come back and hear some reasons to have hope and some actions you can take.
Can't get your fill of Legal AF? Me neither. That's why we formed the Legal AF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from Legal AF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? Legal AF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.